This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. I recently went down to London to go and see some friends, to make some new images, and to see the opening of a new film called Tish, which is a feature-length documentary on the life and work of Tish Murtha, who you've heard me talk about on this channel before. And it's not the topic of this video, but I really would recommend, if it's showing anywhere near you, go along and check it out. I'll leave a link to the trailer down the description below. Anyway, I love going back down to London to make images, but at this time of year in this country, we have a lot of overcast days and heavy lead grey skies. And that kind of flat lighting in a scene just tends to leach all the colour out of it. And it kills the contrast that I really like to work with when I'm making my images. So on those days when the lighting is just super flat, what do you do? The question I always have to ask myself when shooting street is, how can I arrange the elements within the frame to make sure that you as the viewer are looking at the thing I intend you to look at? It's my job to tell the story within a frame, to arrange all those elements, to make sure that you are focusing on the thing that I want you to focus on and not paying too much attention to things in the background that aren't really my intention. I have a couple of options. I can use light and shadow to show what I want people to look at by placing the subject in the light and leaving the rest of the frame darker in comparison, which is obviously a technique I use a lot and have talked about many times on this channel. Shooting this way means I'm seeking spaces and places where the light is playing in interesting ways, but I can only shoot this way on days when the light gives me that contrast to play with. So what about those days when the light is just flat and dull and grey? And we get a lot of those here in the UK, especially at this time of year. Well, another option you have is to use a longer focal length, to narrow down your field of view, to fill your frame with your subject and to shallow up your depth of field, so that you're using the sharpness and blur to show us what we're meant to be looking at, making the subject sharp and hiding the unwanted elements in the bokeh in the background. So that's what I did on this latest trip back down to London. Anticipating that the light would mostly be flat at this time of year, I decided to give myself a challenge and live for the whole trip with my 85mm lens on my camera, which is not at all my normal focal length. And to open that lens right up, to open the aperture right up so that I could really shallow down the depth of field and make sure that my subjects were always sharp, but then it would quickly fall off into bokeh and I could hide those unwanted elements in the blur. It's a legitimate way to shoot and one which works really well on days when the light and the color and the contrast just aren't there. And when you shoot this way, it becomes less about the space and the place and the scene and becomes far more about the subject and particularly those little tiny details. As you fill your frame with the subject and you let the context fall away, as it's not as important as focusing on all the little aspects of that person or that thing that you want us to look at. I'll be honest, after shooting a couple of days like this, I almost had this thought to myself that this feels a little bit like cheating. I mean, it's not like the background isn't important because I still need to make sure that it's clean enough that it doesn't distract and draw attention away. But I could really put out of my mind a lot of the context that that person was standing in, which I often lean on. The context is very important and where the person is in telling the story that I want to tell. So there's a trade-off. I started to lose that, but in its place, I gained some incredibly rich detail on the subject themselves. Suddenly I noticed the texture of their skin, the color of their eyes, the stitching in their clothing, the scars they carry, or the micro-expressions on their faces. And I may have lost the story in the scene, but I've gained new stories in those details. One practical thing that I decided to do was to actually shoot with the camera using the screen more. So if I was shooting portrait orientation like this, or landscape like this. And it gave me a slightly lower angle. I was shooting slightly up at my subjects, but I really liked this approach. And I know that there are a lot of photographers who will get very, very sniffy. You should never shoot using the screen, always shoot using the viewfinder. But I find that this is a lot less confrontational than this when you're shooting subjects on the street. And it's really important for me that if I'm going to be taking candid photographs of people who are walking around in a city, that I want to capture the unguarded moment. I think about shooting this way like shooting with an old TLR, like this Yashica, which you would hold lower down and use the ground glass, which is essentially an analog screen, to frame up your shot. Vivian Maier was famous for using a Rolleiflex this way on the street, and the effect was that she was often less obvious to her subject, who either didn't notice her, helping her to capture a truly candid moment, or who gave her eye contact but not the camera because she didn't hold the camera in front of her face. The result was that she was always shooting slightly upward to her subject as she held the camera at torso height. I had a friend who was a wedding photographer back in South Africa, and he would always say to me that if he was doing the couple shoot on the day of the wedding or doing an engagement shoot beforehand, when he was taking their images, he would always crouch down slightly. And he was a tall guy, so he had to have bulletproof thighs. But he said the reason for that was he always wanted his camera lens slightly lower than their eye line, because he said that psychologically it gave them a more heroic stance, because we as the viewer were literally looking up at those subjects. It probably comes down to personal preference, but I think there's something to that, and I certainly found shooting this way, I liked the fact that it seemed to elevate and celebrate the subjects in the frame a little bit by shooting slightly lower. I mean, if you think about it, we use language like, you know, I don't like the fact that he looks down on me, or I really look up to her. So why wouldn't that idea work visually in our images as well? Just something to think about. So I know that there'll be some of you who are interested in what sort of gear do I take around with me now if I'm using different focal lengths. This is basically my little travel kit. It's really lightweight, it's pretty small, and honestly not too expensive compared to what you could actually get. The camera that I use is the little Sony a7C, which is a full frame mirrorless camera. It's not the a7C II or anything like that. I bought this secondhand, it was pretty reasonable, but it's a great camera. It's the sensor that I'm used to, same picture profiles for filmmaking, and honestly it's a brilliant little camera to carry around. I like the little rangefinder too. Then I have the Sony 35mm 1.8, which is a very affordable, lightweight 35mm prime that has a pretty wide aperture for low light. This is the lens that I bring out on days when there is great light and I want to shoot scenes. That's the one that I go to. Then I have the Zeiss 55mm 1.8, which is probably my favorite lens that I own. You can pick these up really reasonable, especially secondhand. And it's an incredibly sharp lens. Like, it's got that very modern feel to it. But in the background, in the bokeh, it's got that lovely kind of vintage swirl to it. So for me, this is kind of the best of both worlds. This is probably my most used lens when I'm walking around because it can do double duty. Great portraits out of this, but street photography, you can kind of use it on most days. If the light starts to flatten or if it's good, this will do a lot. So this probably lives on my camera the most. And then I have the Sony 85mm that I've been talking about, which is the Sony 85mm 1.8. It's not the fancy 1.2 or 1.4 or anything like that, but 1.8 is absolutely plenty to give yourself a lot of separation. Again, this is a fantastic little lens that is actually super cheap for what you're getting as well. And it's lightweight, it's not chunky and heavy like the others. So that's the way that I think about it. Full frame camera for me, then it's the 35mm for great light days. 55mm is my all-rounder that will do a lot. Depending on whatever conditions you have, this will kind of come out the bag and do pretty much a bit of everything. And when the light is flat, I'm going to my 85mm to really separate my subjects out from the background. And then the only other camera I take with me is the little Ricoh GR3X, which is a 40mm camera. And the reason that I take this with me is because if I don't want to carry a bag around with me when I'm walking around a city and multiple lenses, this just goes in my pocket, or in this little case, it just slings around me like this so I can walk around with no weight at all. But I'm going to be very honest, I will not use the GR if the light is flat. It just doesn't work for me to shoot scenes, not have any options to shallow the depth of field to separate out my subjects. I need good light for this camera. And then all this gear just fits in this little backpack, which means I have hardly any weight to travel with, but I can do anything in almost any conditions. I think I had this idea that I had to stick to one focal length so that there was a consistent look running through all my images. But I've realized now that I've decided to travel with a 35, a 55, and an 85, and to pull those out depending on the lighting conditions on the day, that there are lots of other ways to create consistency in your work. For example, I have a particular point of view. I will notice things that other photographers don't because of the way that I see the world. I compose images a particular way, they're unique to me. I use similar contrast ratios in the way that I tone my images, and I favor particular colors over others. Actually, truth be told, and this is a little bit embarrassing, there were a few years in there where I insisted that I had this one focal length and it was slightly wider, and it meant that if the light was flat outside, I would say it's not conducive to my style of photography, and I'd stay home and not make images. Thank goodness that I finally admitted to myself that there is nothing wrong with choosing the right focal length for the right conditions, because it means I get out there more often in any conditions to make images. So if you're somebody like me who likes shooting on those wider focal lengths but really battles on days when the light is just super dull and flat, maybe it's time to try out some narrower focal lengths, to shallow out your depth of field, and to really make your subject sharp, to focus on those details and to let the background and the context fall into the bokeh in the background. And don't worry too much about focal length consistency. It's okay to shoot wide on some days and narrower on others, because as you apply your eye to all those images across that spectrum and you apply your particular style to that work, in the aggregate, hopefully you'll be telling richer, more interesting stories with the images that you're making. A couple of things just before I go. The first is that there are still copies of Parable magazine available. I'm so proud of these. It's the first time I've really tried to put together my writing and images in a piece of work. And each one will have a different theme. The first one is on window light. I talk about my techniques for photographing and show you some images, but also talk a little bit about the philosophy of light and shadow, and especially our psychology around it. The second one is the Namibia story, where I show portraits of the Himba tribe I took and tell you the story about the ups and downs of that journey and trying to make that body of work. There are some still available. And there will be a new Parable coming out in January, which I'm putting together now. I'm really excited about this one too. To give you a little hint, it's something to do with my past working for the church. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them myself for over a decade now for my own work. Lots of us as photographers want to find ways to sell our work from our website, and the Parable magazine is a good example. So I knew that I wanted a website system where I could set a store up on there, but to be really honest, I was quite intimidated by the process. But with Squarespace, it couldn't have been simpler. I could drag and drop in images of the product, write a description, set a price, and then once it was live and the orders were coming in, I could see all the details, who was ordering, where the orders needed to go to, and once they were shipped out, I could even send an automated email that lets them know what their tracking information is. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.